Hello and welcome. You're watching Rappler Talk. I'm Pauline Macaraeg, lead forensics researcher for Rappler. On January 7, 2025, Meta Platforms, the big tech company of social media platforms Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, announced that it is dropping its third-party fact-checking program in the U.S. This move was made ahead of Trump's second term as U.S. president. Here with us today is Rappler CEO and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa to talk about the implications of Meta's decision and what it means for journalists in other countries, including the Philippines. But before we discuss, here's Rappler's statement.
We are dismayed by Meta's decision to end the fact-checking program in the United States and appalled over statements made by Mr. Zuckerberg bad-mouthing fact-checkers. Fact-checking and verification is a critical due diligence process that responsible journalists and newsrooms go through each time we publish stories to protect the welfare of audiences. This methodology ensures that citizens are equipped with accurate information they need to live their lives better and make informed decisions. Allowing manipulative and harmful content to flourish and gain eyeballs in platforms under the guise of free speech is opportunistic and puts people's health, well-being, and safety at risk. For as long as Meta retains a fact-check program in the Philippines, Rappler intends to continue this engagement, especially during an election year, to protect fellow Filipinos from manipulation and the dangers of disinformation. What has happened in the U.S. is just the beginning. It is an ominous sign of more perilous times in the fight to preserve and protect our individual agency and shared reality.
Okay, Maria, I'll jump right into it now. How do you feel about Meta's announcement that it is dropping its fact-checking program in the U.S.? Did it surprise you at all?
As a trend, we could begin to see this because in January 2023, they literally began to choke traffic to news sites, right? So as in that crucial year of 2024, when 74 countries, about half, a little more than half the world, voted, they were actually getting less facts in their news feeds on Facebook. But to do it so blatantly and in the way that they did with Mark Zuckerberg's statements was both shocking and made me sad, right? You can see this in Rappler's statement. Simultaneously, I will say, having been attacked by 90 hate messages per hour, I'm also angry because not only did Facebook not take responsibility for what it's done, it also took that very minimal layer of safety that's been put there and trashed it, right? And in this way that literally, again, flips the world. Mark Zuckerberg uses the word censorship. I would replace that with safety. So we now have a platform for more than 3.2 billion people around the planet that has just decided that profit's more important than safety.
Right. So why do you think Meta decided on such a move? Is it purely profit? Do you think that? Or and what does this signal to the U.S. and the broader political climate?
So first of all, let me say, as we pointed out in our statement, Rappler remains a fact-checking partner of Facebook. So let me divorce my statements from the operations of Rappler, right? The same way that we would do stories on a company that may advertise on Rappler, that has nothing to do with, these are, there's a great wall between editorial and our operations. It's shocking because it shows to me that Facebook doesn't care about the public sphere. Now, it's probably even shocking to hear me say I'm shocked because over the last, you've done this in your research, right? We have seen over and over and over, profit wins over public good. And that really is the biggest problem with social media. With big tech, there is no technology that has been released that is literally anchored in facts, right? The generative AI that was released in November 2022, 2023.
Yeah.
No, 2022, November 2022. That isn't anchored in facts. In fact, it's a feature. It's built in. And all of the scams and fraudulent schemes that go on Facebook. In fact, the funny part, of course, is that there was a generative AI photo that came out about Mark Zuckerberg shortly after he did this. But I think the other part of it is I still believe there are good people inside Facebook, but the moves like this is opportunistic. It exploits the election of Donald Trump, that President Trump in his second term already has a plan 2025. The man that was banned by Facebook when violence erupted on January 6th is now the Pied Piper for big tech CEOs. That just shows you the gap between values, standards, and ethics, which I still am looking for from tech, and profit.
Right. Let's talk about Meta's plans based on their announcement. Meta said that it is shifting to community notes, similar to what X is doing, the content moderation program on X, which was implemented at scale during Elon Musk's ownership. What do you think about this approach? And can moderation really be left to communities?
Absolutely not. Sorry. It leads to what we had once hoped would be wisdom of the crowds, right? At the beginning of all of this, especially when Rappler was formed, so in 2011, going into 2012, in order to have wisdom of the crowds, you need to have certain elements in place. Those elements are all gone. And then what we're seeing now with this policy shift is turning that wisdom of crowds into a mob. What you're seeing with the community notes on Twitter, X, now X, is a cesspool. It's literally a human cesspool. I don't know anyone now. Part of the reason so many people have left X is precisely because Elon Musk has turned it into his own personal megaphone. There are no controls in place. You see disinformation and information warfare on that platform, and it has literally contributed to exploiting people's weaknesses, our biological weaknesses, right? So I had hoped when Elon Musk bought Twitter, and turned it into X, that both Facebook and Google for YouTube, they had already gone through 2020. There were some safeguards in place, and even then I was like, these safeguards are all palliative. They don't move at the pace of the machine, and nothing has been done about the design of the platform that literally, and this is an MIT study I quote all the time, spreads lies 6 times faster. That was 2018 numbers. By 2024 with X, if anyone did that study, please go do the study. I'm sure it is significantly worse. The mayor of Paris, Ana Hidalgo, decided to leave X and literally said it's human sewage, right? The former president of Cisco says that what you're doing by being on X is drinking from the toilet bowl, right?
Right.
So to have Facebook far larger than X, follow X to the level. It's gone below basement level. It's gone back to hell. Actually, worse hell than we've ever had, right? And then instead of pulling Elon Musk up to greater standards to protect the public sphere, we're seeing it moving into this, literally killing the public information ecosystem, making it impossible to have information integrity. I mean, let's take his statements, right? He said, we're going to give you more speech. The age of Louis Brandeis of that was like 1927, when more speech, his quote is, the more you fight, the way to fight hate speech is with more speech. But you don't have the torrent, the fire hose that big tech now allows, the scale of it. And we've gone through this, and until you go through it, you really don't know. But in order to pound someone to silence, I got to stop being violent. In order to stop that, in order to stop the hacking of our biology, which is, how did it work? Lies spread 6 times faster because they found out that if you're enraged using fear, anger, and hate, you stay on your platform longer. You keep scrolling in rage. And frankly, we already know this from January 6th. Those people then go out. Online violence is real-world violence. Yeah. So it's shocking to me that a company that claims it cares about people have taken away safety measures to protect people, and especially the youth, right?
Right. Actually, big tech always frames this as an issue of freedom of speech, right? Zuckerberg, as you mentioned, said in his announcement that more speech and fewer mistakes. That's what he said about it. But as someone who has experienced, dealing with disinformation firsthand, we know that it goes beyond the issue of free speech. It actually extends to public safety concerns, as you rightly mentioned. So I guess my question is, what responsibility does a platform like Meta have when disinformation leads to real-world harm? And how do we actually make them accountable? I know we've been talking about this for years now, but
8 years.
Right.
Because we've been a target, and that is both a positive and a negative, right? Like, if we were never targeted, we wouldn't have realized how information operations work. I wouldn't have felt that free speech could be used to stifle free speech. I think, and you're talking about tens of millions of dollars in the U.S. in lobby money. I think 2 or 3 years ago, it was $70 million, and it's only increased. In the EU during the time of the debate over the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, again 2 or 3 years ago, 123 million euros. For big tech is now the largest lobbyist. So how do we hold them accountable? That's exactly the problem, right? It's what they've done is profit. And actually, Mark Zuckerberg says this in a few of his videos, profit over country, right? Company over country. Many books have now been written. The evidence is clear in the UK during Brexit on election interference, right? There was actually evidence, and the UK fined Facebook, the largest fine that it's ever had. It's small by Facebook's profit margins and annual revenues. This is a company that gets, a minimum of $300 billion a year. But so election interference, what did Facebook do? It paid the fine, and then it hired the former deputy prime minister of the UK to deal with it, right? But actually, this is interesting because I was looking at this. One of the most interesting things is that it is also willful ignorance for the Western countries that has led us here, right? So in the UK,
talk more about the willful ignorance?
Yeah, and I was rereading the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Christopher Wiley's book, and he actually, I pulled this quote out. He said, "The notion that the wafer-thin Brexit result could have been affected by systematic cheating, data breaches, and foreign interference was willfully ignored because the ramifications were unimaginable." Here's the interesting part. If the same events had happened in Kenya or Nigeria or the Philippines, there would have been prompt calls from British observers to hold a new vote. Right? But because it was happening in their country, that would require, oh my God, it is also our fault, right? Guess which country actually voided an election? And that happened this year.
Romania.
We were looking at that, right? Romania had a runoff election, and when they realized, so the sitting president released intelligence information that showed that Kremlin disinformation on TikTok skewed their results. The guy who won and would have become president is a guy who had no political party and was backed by the Kremlin. So it was fascinating. But imagine if Romania, if that courage to declare it void, to void the election results, was done in 2016 in the United States or in 2016 at Brexit. Again, what was fascinating is the people who did this were actually rewarded, right? So this is the level of impunity that has already taken over our world. And that's part of the new normalization that we have to fight. Again, part of the reason I think we can see this clearly is because this happened to us.
Right.
It happened in the Philippines. And guess what? 6 months, within 6 months of information operations of President Rodrigo Duterte's oath-taking, our institutions collapsed and he became the most powerful leader this nation has ever had.
I can remember that clearly. All right, on that note, Meta said that the move will only affect U.S. fact-checkers at this point, but I think we can agree that the ripple effects could extend far beyond. So zooming out of the U.S., how does this spell danger for journalists and truth-tellers in other countries, including the Philippines?
Where the U.S. goes, it drags the world. I mean, whether we like it or not, right? Tariffs, for example, that incoming President Trump is pushing forward will choke traffic globally. I mean, traffic of real world goods, right? Look, it's so fascinating for us here sitting in the Philippines to watch American media dealing with the same issues we had to deal with in 2016. How do you call out power, right? The cartoonist at the Washington Post who decided to resign because the Washington Post didn't run her cartoon of Jeff Bezos genuflecting to Donald Trump. I mean, again, we have lived through this. And I feel like the first Trump presidency came in at a time when its institutions were strong. And remember, at that point, we were saying, wow, this is the difference between our weak institutions in the Philippines and the United States. But those institutions have been weakened, significantly weakened. It is now 8 years into information operations to disinformation and the growth of cognitive biases and the polarization. We have never seen an America as divided as it is today. And President Trump is coming in far more knowledgeable about the way government works and with people who are far more loyal to him than the first time he came into office. Very much like the Philippines, right? So what will happen with the global, this is the shift that's happening globally. Will democracy survive this? This is truly why I had such a bleak outlook for 2025.
I think I've been thinking that since last year.
2024 was really we could still do something about it because it was elections.
Right.
It was the year of elections. There were 74 elections this year. The last one was December 29th in Chad.
Yeah.
But we didn't do enough. Or media, even the coverage of American media, of how Americans voted for me, totally discounts the impact of big tech, which has shifted everything online, right? So I worry.
Right. Actually, last year, together with NERV, we published a critical assessment of the U.S. information ecosystem, right? And that was ahead of the U.S. elections. And we highlighted how Americans navigate splintered realities brought about by failures in social media policies, generational divides in media consumption habits, and hyper-partisan narratives that just bring out the worst in human nature. So how do you see this Meta decision impacting today's already fragmented and kind of corrupted information ecosystem in the U.S. and probably in the Philippines also?
I think so. From where the U.S. is going to go, right? It's not as if information stays only in the U.S.
Right.
If someone publishes it, we get it, right? The same way that even though Facebook was shut down in Canada, supposedly, right? People can no longer define what news is and what it isn't. And that's part of the reason Canadians still go to Facebook for news, even though they technically don't get news, right? So I think part of the problem that we're going to deal with right now is the meta-narratives, the insidious manipulation that is at the cellular level of a democracy. Because there's 3 different levels that you have to look at: the individual, the group or society, and the government itself, right? So in all of this, emergent human behavior is what I wind up calling the third one. And there isn't enough research, but now over time we have it. But none of that data has really been released by the platforms. So at the individual level, the question we have today is really, do we still have individual agency, right? In the United States, one of the things that NERV found was that the generation gap has never been as strong. What did you find about the generation gap, and what's the difference?
The trend between the different generations, for example, with millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, and the Gen Zs, it's very different the way they consume media. The way we know it, Gen Zs they grew up online, right? But that doesn't mean that they know how to identify which are factual or not.
Correct.
And that's where the danger lies, actually. Yeah.
And one of the things that came out is 60% of that 18 to 34 years old get their news from social media. And I'm going to put news in rabbit ears because they really don't distinguish. In fact, they prefer to hear it from an influencer. Don't call a journalist an influencer, even though technically, I suppose journalists were the first ones. Content creators. I also dislike that. But anyway, but I would say this is the biggest problem, and this is also what we saw hand in hand with what NERV found, right? Was the targeting, the micro-targeting of specific groups of people. In March last year, Voto Latino was pointing out that Latino Gen Zs were being bombarded with meta-narratives of how much of a colonial power America was. These were voter suppression meta-narratives. But if you put it together like this, right? So let's go back to 2016 and let's go to where we are today. In 2016, Christopher Wiley said that Steve Bannon, who was behind the Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon went to they did statistical surveys to find out the people who didn't like being politically correct, right? Because the only way we moved society forward, made women vote, hello America, right?
The woke.
The only way progressive values shifted was because of name and shame, right? This tactic of civil society and human rights groups, name and shame. If you are sexist, name and shame, and it makes people more progressive. But what wound up happening in 2016 was Steve Bannon then figured out that there were all these people who were angry about being politically correct. And so by the time the 2016 elections happened, they had one Facebook page, and I'm going to call it in rabbit ears, in every single county in America, county level, targeting young men. Because it was the young men they found that were closest to dissatisfaction and violence. And what's fascinating now is if you look at the studies, where did that come from, by the way? Gamergate, right? From gaming,
yeah.
MMORPG. Again, I always go back to online violence is real world violence. The data shows us that. But so what wound up happening was these young men, fast forward to today and what we found with young American men, right? And you can see the results in the elections. You have more progressive young women, and you have young men who grew up much more isolated, right? Because post-COVID is the other thing that let these conspiracy theories also go is they stayed online, they weren't as socialized, and they became far angrier and more conservative, right? So you have younger, progressive American women who, be careful who you date. No, sorry, young men. Be careful what you read on social media, right? So I'm sorry to go all the way back to that, but imagine if the manipulation began then and continues until today, because the algorithm of growth is friends of friends. That's still the same. And friends of friends polarizes. Sorry.
That makes sense, yeah. No, that's very good context, actually, especially for our audiences who are not really that familiar with this. So I just want to take it back to something that's closer to us here in the Philippines. You know, Rappler is one of Facebook's third-party fact-checking
Sure.
partners since 2018, and
Yep.
we've been fact-checking since 2016, right?
Yep.
How will Rappler navigate this as one of Meta's third-party fact-checking?
Sure. I mean, so first of all, fact checking is journalism,
Right.
right? It's the basic minimum. And frankly,
It's part of the workflow, actually.
and let me remind you first of what Facebook first did was to hire journalists. And then when they were attacked, they didn't hold the line. They fired the journalists and created a third party fact checking system. I tend to call this, you know, if you look at big tech's actions, everything tends to be proxy, right? They don't want to take personal accountability, which is part of the reason the people who run the company can then always put their business first. Right? And this is part of the reason we keep going back to what are the standards and ethics that drive you when you touch the public sphere. So, as a fact checker, we were one of the first in the Philippines to join the fact checking group, and we will continue working with Facebook. So, hello, Facebook. Facebook, I think, we were essentially alpha partners with Facebook from 2016, which was when they opened an office in the Philippines, right? An office to market. And then since then, we've been the ones that have shared the data that we have. They've given us data. We've gone through, and there were takedowns that happened in 2017, 2018, 2019. The very first person who was actually private person who was banned from Facebook was a Filipino, right? One of the guys who led the Duterte machine. Someone we all know. Anyway, and then Christopher Wiley in 2018 was banned. So we will continue fact-checking because it's important. For 6 years in a row until 2021, Filipinos spent the most time online and on social media globally. Facebook was our internet, just like Myanmar. And so for us to stop, it goes against the grain, right? We will do all we can so that we have no regrets later on. Having said that, it's become increasingly the gap between me and Rappler in terms of what I say and the rage sometimes that I feel, the anger at the corruption of our public information ecosystem shocks me because it shows an utter disregard for the processes of democracy. I think that's the biggest, this is what the statement shows, right? And it also shows two things. You can see, he also mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg mentioned that they would move from California, which has stricter laws, to Texas, following X. And he essentially genuflected to incoming President Trump, and will he use the United States as Elon Musk has threatened against European regulations. So that means that only the Europeans will actually be safe on the platforms, but that now they will fight frontally. In order to be able to do that, they use disinformation, which is to call it censorship instead of actually safety issues, right? Like they created a product that is harmful to us. It is harmful to the kids. And the evidence, again, Jonathan Haidt's latest book is called The Anxious Generation. But beyond that, just look at our societies. And yet they haven't taken responsibility for the harms. They've moved forward to say, this is really humanity. That's not true. And we have the data to prove it.
Right. We have lots of data to prove it, actually. I'm actually down to the last question. So we've talked about what journalists can do, what big tech should do. Now, I know a number of people outside our industry who are also concerned with what's happening. So I guess my last question would be, what can ordinary people do to ensure that our collective years-long effort of combating online disinformation and information operations to not go to waste following this move?
This is a tipping point. And I think if you do not add your voice to demand better, if you do not watch for yourself and your family, you will be manipulated. And the irony, of course, is that Americans, part of the American exceptionalism is that they believe they won't be manipulated. They believe that that this is their own. But the reality is that we must demand better. We must collaborate together to create a public information ecosystem that has information integrity. And there were some government initiatives, right? The Hiroshima from Japan for the G7, and we were part of the G20 Declaration on Information Integrity. But this isn't enough, because what we're seeing globally is a failure of governance. Does rule of law still exist? The UN needs to do that. You're seeing the exact same tactics used by the budding dictators, from Putin to the CEOs of the tech companies, which is, you see media capture, NGO capture, academic capture, and this was a news organization in South Africa that showed state capture, right, of South Africa before these last elections. So I guess part of it is, this is it, right? If we don't do something right now, we will lose our ability to have independent thought and to be able to create a world that is transparent and fair and where democracy can survive, i.e., where we're not being manipulated by meta-narratives that are pounding us in information operations, where geopolitical power isn't doing this in our information sphere, but where we have the ability to think slow and actually talk about climate change, for example. The fact that so many more people think the world is flat. The fact that, far-right fringe figures in Brazil, Bolsonaro was a far-right fringe figure, but YouTube's clustering algorithm, recommendation algorithm, connected him with every single conspiracy theorist and moved him to the center, and he became president. I would say the same thing happened with Duterte, President Duterte in the Philippines. The Philippines is lucky at this point. Elections worked, but we moved from hell to purgatory, and we have the same. We have problems. Kleptocracy still continue all around the world. Wow, so bleak. So we got to do more. We got to run the same way we did in 2018 when I thought I was going to go to jail for the rest of my life. I thought Rappler was going to get shut down. We're still here. And I think this is it. The world must move.
That was bleak, yeah, but it actually kind of brought back some hope in me because I was kind of sad from earlier this morning following the news. Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your insights and expertise with us. And we hope this conversation helps our audience better understand the complexities of this issue. But our conversation doesn't end here. Let's continue the discussion rolling on the Rappler Communities app. Just download the app on your mobile device and join the Everyday Tech and Maria's Journal chat rooms. Once again, this is Pauline Macaraeg for Rappler Talk. Thank you for joining us.